Module A5, Objective 13, we're going to look at the steps in a neural reflex and how neural reflexes are classified. Neural reflex it's an automatic rapid response to some type of stimuli. Just an example, if you were to put your hand on a hot stove, it's automatically pulled away. So there's some type of response, there's some type of signal or reflex that is in place to prevent damage to your hand. The basic building blocks of neurologic function is found within these reflexes, and we find that one neural reflex produces one motor response, and this is something we'll investigate shortly. And this is done through a reflex arc. A reflex arc is the wiring of a single reflex. It begins at a receptor. In the case of our placing our hand on a hot plate, this would be a thermoreceptor in the skin of our hand. And it ends at some type of peripheral effector. And again, in our case, we're looking at muscles that are used to pull our hand away. We find that these reflex arcs generally oppose the original stimulus, some type of negative feedback, inhibition. The hot plate, our hand being placed on a hot plate, then causes our hand to be pulled away. This is a negative feedback mechanism. The actual steps of a neural reflex includes the arrival of some type of stimulus, and this is going to activate the receptor. In the case of our example with the hot plate, it's the thermoreceptor due to the heat, which is the arrival of the stimulus. We have the activation of a sensory neuron, so that thermoreceptor is going to activate a sensory neuron that is going to be sent to the central nervous system via the afferent division. That information is processed by postsynaptic cells, and that processing can occur either in the brain or the spinal cord. And that's going to lead to an activation of a motor neuron. Motor, you should think muscle, and this is going to cause a response from the peripheral effector. And in this case, it would be the musculature of the arm, which then allows the arm to be pulled away from the heat source. So here we have an actual example, and I probably should have used the tack to be consistent instead of the hot plate, but a hand is placed on a tack. So the arrival of the stimulus and the activation of the receptor is occurring here in step 1, and that's going to activate a sensory neuron. Here we have our sensory neuron, which is heading to the spinal cord. The information processing of the CNS, it's being processed here in the spinal cord, and that's going to cause the activation of a motor neuron, which would be the biceps brachii here, the effector, which then pulls the hand off the tack. This is the response by the effector. These are they're kind of interesting. They're neat to see how they're related. So I would really spend some time going through these steps to make sure you understand. One of the key points here is the information processing occurs at the level of the spinal cord, not the brain itself. When we classify reflexes, we can classify them by one of 4 methods or 4 different types of classification schemes. We can classify by development. Developmentally, we have innate reflexes and acquired reflexes. Innate refers to the fact that we were born with these reflexes. So what type of reflexes come with birth? These are genetically imprinted. They can be very simple, such as with the withdrawal from pain, or they can be more complex. If you think of a child, a newborn, their ability to suckle or once they are able to see, they track things, movements with their eyes. These are all innate reflexes. And by development, we also have acquired reflexes. These are reflexes that are learned. For instance, the textbook cites that an experienced driver steps on a brake when trouble appears ahead. This is almost this is a type of reflex. It's something that's done without conscious decision. It's a reflex that is developed by learning. The book also talks about an experienced skier is able to position or move his or her body in such a way to avoid some obstacle. Again, this is acquired. It's something that is learned. Reflexes can be classified by response, and by response we have somatic reflexes and visceral reflexes. Somatic, you should think skeletal muscle, so it controls skeletal muscle contractions, while visceral controls actions of the smooth and cardiac muscle, as well as glands. And we'll look at some examples of these. You can classify reflexes based on complexity of the circuit. Here we have monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes. Monosynaptic referring to one synapse, while polysynaptic refers to more than one. And lastly, we can classify reflexes based on the processing site. We have processing occurring at the level of the spinal cord or the cranium itself, the brain or the spinal cord, basically. So again, we identified innate reflexes based on reflexes that are formed before birth. And here we gave some examples. We looked at suckling or tracking objects with the eye. I'll put tracking movement with the eye. And then acquired reflexes are going to be automatic, learned motor patterns. And the two examples given by the book are an experienced driver or an experienced skier being able to react to some type of stimulus automatically. Motor responses can be somatic or visceral. Somatic, involuntary control of the muscular system, the skeletal muscular specifically. A good example of this would be the deep tendon reflexes, or the knee-jerk reflex, in which a physician would hit the region around the patella, causing stretch receptors to facilitate the knee-jerk reflex. Visceral reflexes, or autonomic reflexes, these are controlling other systems other than the muscular. The complexity of the neural circuit, monosynaptic. Again, these are sensory neuron synapses directly to a motor neuron. There's only one synapse between these within a monosynaptic reflex. Polysynaptic refers to at least one interneuron between the sensory and the motor neuron. Can be hundreds. And then lastly, the site of information processing. Spinal reflexes occur in the spinal cord, while cranial reflexes occur in the brain, or at least the processing occurs in the brain. In Objective 14, we're going to differentiate between monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes, listing characteristics of each and examples. In a monosynaptic reflex, a stretch reflex, you have the least amount of delay between sensory input and motor output. And again, this should make perfect sense. When you have one neuron connecting to another, so here you have the actual sensation, being picked up by one neuron, and it's going to then relay that information to a motor neuron, which is going to cause some type of movement. Here we have the knee jerk, as the hammer is activated, and it presses on the tendon below the patella. This sends a signal that runs to the spinal cord, and you have one synapse that is relayed to the motor neuron, which causes the effect, basically the contraction of the leg muscle, which then causes the knee jerk. This has the least delay, mainly because the time wasted between waiting for the neurotransmitter to relay the signal from the presynaptic neuron to the post is very short. You only have one synapse to deal with. In cases where you may have hundreds of synapses, that time delay waiting for the neurotransmitter to diffuse across the cleft and bind the postsynaptic membrane, that adds up. Okay, again, this is with only one synapse that it has the least delay between sensory input and the motor output. This particular reflex is completed within 20 to 40 milliseconds. It's a tremendous speed in which this occurs. Postural reflexes. These are also stretch reflexes, as the muscles within the torso stretch due to posture. It causes effectors in order to maintain the normal upright posture. So if you were to lean a certain way, you would stretch muscles on one side of the body, and that will send a signal, which then automatically allows for compensation so that the posture is maintained. And this is an automatic maintenance of the balance. Polysynaptic reflexes, obviously they have more than one synapse. We're dealing with more than one synapse, so there's slightly increased length of time for this reflex to be carried out. And often these interneurons can control more than one muscle group, and we'll look at a complicated example in a minute. With polysynaptic reflexes, you have the production of either EPSPs or IPSPs, and we'll see how these interplay. The tendon reflex specifically prevents skeletal muscles from developing too much tension, which ultimately could tear or break a tendon. Sensory receptors, unlike the muscle spindles that we've seen before, or the proprioceptors that we've seen before. One good example is the withdrawal reflex, where you move a body part away from the stimulus, whether it's pain or pressure. And a good example of this would be the flexor reflex. It pulls a hand away from a hot stove. You have flexion. And we find that the strength and the extent of the response ultimately depends on the intensity and the location of the stimulus. Here we actually see it in diagrammatic form. We see that a painful stimulus is going to release an action potential that is going to synapse at an interneuron, and that interneuron is going to synapse at the motor neuron, which then causes the arm muscle to contract and the hand to be pulled away from the hot stimulus. Also note that that interneuron is going to send a signal up within the central nervous system as well. Reciprocal inhibition, for flexor reflexes to work, the stretch reflex of antagonistic muscle must be inhibited by the interneurons in the spinal cord. So if you consider your forearm and your arm, we know that we have the biceps brachii. This is a muscle that allows us to flex our forearm. But we also have the triceps, a muscle group on the back that works antagonistically. The biceps allows us to flex our forearm, while the triceps allows us to extend our forearm. Flexion, extension. So in reciprocal inhibition, when you were to place your hand on the hot stove, not only is the signal sent to the somatic, to the biceps to flex, but a signal is also going to be sent to the triceps to relax, so that the hand has no opposition as flexion occurs. And this, again, is referred to as reciprocal inhibition. Reflex arcs, we have the ipsilateral reflex arc. And in this case, you have occurrence on the same side of the body as the stimulus. So we saw this with the stretch, the tendon, and the withdrawal reflexes. If you put your hand on a hot stove, only that hand pulls away. Your other hand does nothing. You have no effect on the other hand, for instance. And that's the ipsilateral reflex arcs. The crossed extensor reflexes involve the contralateral reflex arc. So this occurs on the opposite side of the stimulus as well. Just an example, for instance, if somebody were to trip, you would have a signal, a reflex in play in which both legs are affected, even though only one leg actually participated in the tripping event. And I think we have a diagram next, and here you have one. When one leg steps on a tack, not only is this leg going to react by pulling off the tack, but the other leg also has to react to receive the weight of the body, the entire weight of the body. So this is a good example of a crossed extensor reflex in which both sides of the body are affected, and here you actually see how those neurons are related. The sensory neuron is going to synapse with an interneuron. That's going to send a signal up to the central nervous system, or higher up in the central nervous system. It's going to send the signal to the leg that actually stepped on the tack, and then it's going to send a signal to the other leg to allow it to prepare to receive the weight of the body as the foot that had stepped on the tack is being pulled away. There are 5 general characteristics of a polysynaptic reflex. They involve pools of neurons, as we've seen before. They're intersegmental in distribution. They can involve reciprocal inhibition. They have reverberating circuits. This is going to prolong the reflexive motor response seen in many of these reflexes. And we find that reflexes tend to cooperate in order to produce a coordinated, controlled response to some stimulus. In Objective 15, we're going to explain how the brain can affect spinal cord-based reflexes. So these are reflexes that are completely controlled at the level of the spinal cord, yet the brain can actually tap into those reflexes and use them consciously. So we find that reflex behaviors are automatic, and the processing centers of the brain can actually facilitate or inhibit those reflex motor patterns that are based in the spinal cord. So even though these are automatic, the signal reaches the spinal cord, it never ascends to the brain, or it's not controlled by the brain. The brain can commandeer those reflexes, and they can either facilitate or inhibit those reflexes. The voluntary movements and the reflex motor patterns, we find that higher centers of the brain can incorporate lower reflexive motor patterns, or automatic reflexes. Automatic reflexes can be activated by the brain when that reflex is needed, and it can use a few nerve impulses to control a complex motor function that is already laid out by the reflex that is controlled by the spinal cord. So examples would be walking, running, or jumping. These are reflexes that are contained by the spinal cord, where you have these patterns of neuronal function that are very complex, being controlled by a few nerve impulses from the brain. You have the reinforcement of spinal reflexes. Higher centers can reinforce spinal reflexes by creating EPSPs at reflex motor neurons, and this is going to facilitate the postsynaptic neurons. You can also have an inhibition of spinal reflexes by the brain, and this is through the creation of IPSPs at the reflex motor neurons, suppressing those postsynaptic neurons. The last slide, we just introduced the Babinski reflexes. The Babinski sign is a splaying of the toes if the lateral side of the plantar region of the foot is actually stimulated. And this is a normal response in infants due to the fact that these reflexes aren't yet connected. These reflexes aren't in place. But this is also an indication of central nervous system damage in adults if they exhibit a positive Babinski sign. And the thought is that in infants, these pathways are not yet developed, but by the time you reach adulthood, they are. So if an adult indicates a positive Babinski sign, it can indicate CNS damage due to some type of severing of this connection. And you can read more about this reflex in Figure 1321 on page 455.